The main point of this lab is to become aware of the diversity of plant life on Earth as part of the bigger picture of studying the diversity of all life on Earth. So we're just going to start out with a simple exercise here that you could do pretty much anywhere. It's to take a look at a place like this, a close cropped lawn, that the average person would look at and say, oh, it's just a big smear of green. There's plants on it, you know? Well, there are many kinds of plants. How many would you think would be growing in a place like this with cars going by and all cut like that and seeming very tame and everything like that? We want to take a close look at this and just say, well, how many species are there here? Let's find out. You don't have to just wonder, you can actually look. So we're going to get down on our hands and knees and poke through here and see how many kinds we can come up with. So the point here is not to make names for these yet, it's just to say what looks different from the other ones. So just kinds of plant. Let's just stop here for now. You can do this in greater detail, but Leanne and I both did some sampling. We used the same lawn, but notice we have different numbers of things here. Sometimes people notice things more detailed than other folks do. Sometimes people lump things into the same category, whereas others split them apart, so you get more categories. But let's just check it out here. Leanne, how many kinds did you get?
Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, about 10.
Yeah, I only got 7. So the point here, actually there's several points. One of them is there's more here than just one kind of plant. It's not just a green smear. It's not just grass. As a matter of fact, there are many kinds of grass here. I found 2 right away. This looks like hair. This one's got bigger blades on it, things like that. There's another thing to look at here as well, is to look behind us where the woods are, where it hasn't been mowed. And the average person might think, well, you know, maybe it's got a whole lot more species because this is tame and that's wild and it should have more species. So we're going to do the same thing right here and go check the edges of the woods. Again, not with woody plants with sticks or anything, but just the green kinds. So we're now going to repeat this over here. There's a little rule of thumb here. When we do this as a group, we also we try not to over harvest. So we'll take it only if there are 10 or more of the same kind there, and we will only take 1 and things like that. So no need to worry about damaging entire species around here. All right, this is what I got over on the mowed part, and here's what I got in the unmowed part. And again, we don't have to give them names or anything. I just want to see how many kinds we got.
I got 8.
10, 11. So you got how many?
I only got 8 this time.
And I think we would have probably got more if we spent more time.
More time.
They look like you got some different ones from me as well.
I did. We were in a little bit different spot.
Yeah.
So I got sidetracked because I was seeing some really unique things.
Right. So one of the lessons from this little simple exercise is, if you notice, we did get more kinds of plant in this uncut place, which sort of makes sense, right? If you're chopping them down, some plants can't survive it, other ones can. But if you notice, there are not that many more kinds in this uncut part. So it repeats the lesson we hopefully learned back over there, that there's a lot more than often meets the eye in the natural world. What looks like just a green smear has almost as many species in it as the edge of the woods over here. And one reason why it might be hard to recognize how diverse that little lawn is because they're cut and the plants don't get to grow fully. We'll give you a hint of that right here if we'll just scan this right here. These are the same plants that are over there, but they have not been mowed in a while. So you can see that some of them are going to grow up into those orange flowers, happen to be called hawkweed. There's many kinds of grass here. Look at these grass heads. There's one species right there that's making little flowers right now. And here's a whole other kind right here. You can tell by the reproductive parts. like that. So back over in the mode part, it's really hard to tell them apart. So hopefully you've gotten a taste of the take-home lesson. The diversity of plant life, even in a spot like this, is a lot greater than the average person thinks.
And be aware of your preconceived notions. If you closed your eyes and said, I'm standing here on a mowed lawn, how many species of plants are there? How many kinds of plants are there under my feet? You might picture yourself standing like on a golf course and say only one, grass. And so it's very different from that. So beware of your preconceived notions.
What we're going to do in this lab and the next lab is really focus on the distinction between flowering plants and non-flowering plants. So the non-flowering plants that we're going to look at are a number of categories.
They all have these long jawbreaker scientific names, but basically it's ferns, horsetails, and mosses are the three we're going to look at right around here. So Leanne, you've got some, right?
I do. So I found a few. I have an example of a horsetail. Horsetails are in the division Sphenophyta.
And you have another kind here, right?
I do. Here's an example of a fern. Most of you are probably familiar with ferns. This one, the common name is sensitive fern. So we'll show you as we walk around campus what the life cycle of this is like too. So these, again, are not flowering plants. They don't produce flowers and seeds. They produce spores. So all of these non-flowering plants are spore producers. And they're more primitive, right, Curt?
Yeah, in the sense of primitive, they're modern species just like any other plant, but they've been around the longest. So the earliest plants on Earth were mosses, and then these kinds of horsetails and ferns. Some of them were as big as trees in those days. So let's head over to into the woods a little more, and we'll see some of these alive and up close. Okay. All right, so right here we have some examples of non-flowering plants. We're gonna help you learn the actual names of some of these plants that live on the campus that you're gonna see over and over again, even outside of class. So we're gonna ask you to learn this kind of fern out of the many kinds that grow around here. It's called sensitive fern. There are different ways to identify them. We won't get too fancy, but basically just kind of get a sense of the shape. They got these wobbly edges. We'll show you some other kinds where the edges of the leaves are more finely broken up and things like that. What they'll have in common with all the plants is that they're green. Most plants are green. Most of them trap sunlight and make food with photosynthesis, so these do that too. If you look at their little leaves, they've got veins running through it where the sap runs. The sugar they make from photosynthesis goes through that, and it supports the plant just like the blood in your own veins. So that's pretty typical of most plants, but there's something really different with these compared to the flowering plants that we see around most plant diversity, and it's how they reproduce. So you might think, well, it's a plant, right? Plants have flowers. Okay, where's the fern flower? And you don't see it. In fact, there was even a mythology in the old days in Europe. People thought they had invisible flowers because they thought all plants had to have flowers. There are none. That's why people couldn't see them. So how do these reproduce? Is it just with cuttings or something? Well, if you look close, there's something else around here where these are growing, and it's these brown things. And if you look down on the bottom, it's coming out of the same patch of ground, sometimes near right where the stem of another fern is. This is actually a fern also. They're both adult ferns. They're all connected under the ground. This kind is green and leafy, so it traps sunlight, and it has basically almost nothing to do with reproduction. It's just a food supplier. This one is for reproduction. And if you looked inside here, there would be tiny, tiny little things. Actually, this has gone by now. We'll show you some more with spores in them. But basically, it would look like brown dust inside here, and each little particle of dust would have a plant embryo in it, and it's called a spore. That's different from a seed. A seed has the little plant embryo, but also some food, and it's bigger. So this stuff is making baby plants. So these are both sensitive fern. The whole plant is connected under the ground. These are both the same adults, but they're reproducing. So that's kind of cool. You know, there's a hidden connection going on here that has nothing to do with flowers and seeds. But then it gets even weirder. When these spores come out, they fall on the ground and they start to grow, just like a seed would. But there's something weird that happens then. When they sprout, they don't come up looking like this or this. They come up looking like a tiny little green leafy thing hidden down in the leaf litter and in the soil. I've never seen one around here. You got to be the right time of year. They're hard to find, but that's what they grow up into. So that's pretty weird. It's like, okay, here the parents are, and you think they're going to make babies that look like them, but actually their babies don't look like them. It's as if you had a family and you gave birth to turtles instead of babies. So that's weird. All right, so imagine you could see one of these. I'll just hold up, if I'm pretending I'm holding one. That's an adult plant and it's as big as it gets. It's down in here. It's called a gametophyte. And if you translate that, it means a plant that has sex with sperm or eggs. So this is gonna get even weirder, right? So they got these little sexually reproducing versions of the ferns down in here. They trade sperm and eggs down in here. And when those eggs get fertilized, guess what they grow up into? These. So that's totally bizarre. These reproduce with spores. Their kids grow up and reproduce with sperm and eggs. Then when they have babies, their kids grow up and reproduce with spores again. So if you were a fern, you would look like your grandparents, not your parents. You would have kids who look like turtles. They would reproduce and have babies, and out of the eggs would come human babies. And it goes back and forth, turtles, humans, turtles, humans, turtles, humans. Or in this case, sporophytes, gametophytes, sporophytes, gametophytes, alternating back and forth through the generations. So that's a general term called alternation of generations. That's in your handout, it's in lecture. That's a more detailed, hidden, secret story of fern reproduction going on right here all the time that most people have no clue about. This is another kind of fern we'd like you to know because it's very common. It's called bracken fern. This one's got more branches than sensitive fern does, and the edges are more finely cut. And one of the easiest ways to remember that this is bracken fern is that it branches in three right here. It splits right there into one branch, another branch, and another branch. So they're growing in here without their spores on a separate stalk. That's also different from sensitive ferns. They don't have a separate stalk for the sporophyte. These make the spores on their leaves. But unfortunately for us, most years they don't do it. And this is another year. If you could see them, they would be on the underside around the edges on here, and they're not here. But this would be a sporophyte of bracken fern. The genus name is Pteridium. The genus name for sensitive fern is Onoclea. So there are many, many kinds of fern in the world. We just are having you learn two, bracken fern and sensitive fern, but we do want to show you some others. Here's some right here in the wetland near the edge of the lake. It doesn't branch like bracken does, but it's still got the more finely divided up leaves like this. Here's the separate stalk with the fern spores on it. And the great thing about this is, if you look close, I'm not sure if, let me put a white background on, maybe that will help. But you can actually see the spores coming off.
Oh!
That dust there.
It's green.
Every one of those is so tiny you'd need a microscope to see it on here. Look at that stuff. There are thousands and thousands of little spores. Every one has a fern embryo in it. So just imagine the numbers that are coming out of here, blowing all over the place. Most of them don't make it. If they're lucky and they land on the right kind of soil, they might sprout and make a new plant like this. But remember, if they do, they're going to grow into little gametophytes that aren't going to look like this. It's the next generation that's going to then grow up from the sperm and eggs and look like this again. Alternation of generations, non-flowering plants with no flowers, no seeds involved at all. So here are a bunch of horsetails, and these are in a separate division from the ferns. There's Sphenophyta, which means wedge plant, and the reason I call it that is because in the spring, when these are first sprouting, they don't come up looking like these green leafy things. There's another version that comes up. It's brown. It just looks like a plain old stick with a knob on the end. It looks like a wedge. So Sphenophyta means wedge plant. It's named after what it looks like. Well, if you remember what we saw with sensitive ferns, where you get the leafy green ones and the spore producing ones separate, that's the same story here. The first ones to come up have the spores. They're gone now. This is the green leafy version. Both of these would be part of the same plant. They reproduce with spores. The spores fall to the ground, hatch out into tiny little gametophyte plants, and they grow up and live their lives. When they're ready to reproduce, they make sperm and eggs. The sperm swim around out here, so make sure you wipe off your boots on a wet day in the woods. And if they fertilize an egg down in here with the little gametophytes, they sprout and grow into these things. So these have alternation of generations as well. Never make a flower, never make a seed. So we've got the ferns doing it. We got the horsetails doing it. They usually like a kind of a damp area like this. And there's one other group we're going to look at pretty soon too. It'll be the mosses. And then deeper in the woods, there's a whole other group called Lycophytes that we're also going to look at. So here's some more horsetails growing on the edge of the wetland right here. They call them horsetails because they look like horsetails. But another common name for them was scouring rush. And if you could touch these, you'd feel them. They're sort of rough, almost like steel wool. And that's because their silica, the same stuff that's in the sand right here, is embedded in their leaves and their tissues. So it's very rough. And so early settlers used them as scouring rushes for cleaning pots and pans, like Brillo pads, basically, like that, or SOS pads. So that's the common name for these scouring rushes.
And what division are those again?
That's Sphenophyta, or the wedge plants. Whereas the ferns are Polypodiophyta, or many-footed.
Yeah. You're right.
So these are mosses right here. They don't have veins in their leaves. They never make flowers, and they never make seeds. So they're in their own division. It's called Bryophyta, which means moss plants. This one right here is kind of dried out. Normally it's really, really fluffy green. Looks like a miniature pine tree almost. It's called Polytrichum, which means many bristles. So I'm going to pluck one of these right now and hold it in the sunlight a little bit by my hand. Okay, so these leaves are normally spread out. Now they're closed, and the reason they're closed is because they're drying out. The things fold over like that to conserve moisture when the weather's pretty dry like it is right now. When it starts to rain or there's a lot of dew, they'll open up like that. So, but you can kind of see that it's bristly. So the deal with these mosses is they also reproduce differently from the way flowering plants do it. So what we've actually got here is two plants in one. The green part is a full adult moss plant called Polytrichum. This reproduces not with seeds, not even with spores. It reproduces with sperm and egg. So there's a whole cluster of them here. Some are male and some are female. The males make little sperm, the females make little eggs. On a wet day, when they're all ready to do what they do, the sperm will be kind of wriggling around in here. So again, wipe your hands off on a wet day in the woods. And they'll follow a chemical trail, get to the egg and fertilize it. If it gets fertilized, the little egg is going to sprout into a baby moss plant. But the baby moss plant is not going to look like the parent. It's going to be this thing, which looks like just a little stalk, oh, that's just part of the plant. No, it isn't. It's a plant all of its own. It's the offspring. This thing is the offspring of that. This is the mom, and that's the kid. And it's like, mom never let go of the kid when she gave birth. It's still attached to mom. That would be embarrassing if it was people. And this baby plant has no leaves, no way of making a living. It's totally a parasite on its mother. The one thing it does is reproduce, and it does it with spores. So this little bump on the end is a capsule full of tiny spores. The regular name for this moss, Polytrichum, is haircap moss. And the reason for that is, I'll see if I can get it to do this. This blob on the end where the spores are has a little cap on it that's sort of fibrous, and you can sometimes pull it off. It might not be mature enough for me to do that, but like there it is. The little hair cap just popped off. So that's where it gets its name, haircap moss. It's all kind of a woven thing. Here's the capsule. When that's mature, there's a little lid that would pop off, and it's probably a little early now, and you could shake out a little bit of brown dust or greenish dust, and that would be spores that this thing is reproducing with. So to repeat, that's an adult moss plant. It's a gametophyte, reproduces with eggs. When the egg gets fertilized, it grows into a plant that reproduces with spores, called a sporophyte. When those spores fall on the ground, they'll grow into gametophytes, and the cycle goes around and around. Gametophytes give birth to sporophytes, they give birth to more gametophytes, and around, alternating the generations. So we're going to ask you to learn the genus name of this. Polytrichum means many bristles. The regular name is haircap moss. There's another moss we're going to ask you to learn the name of, and that's in bogs and wetlands. It's called sphagnum moss or peat moss. So here we are on a wetland. Wetlands can be classified based on the kinds of plants that are growing in them. So I'm going to move this aside. We've got all kinds of plants growing in here. There are three basic sorts of wetland that some of you may end up using later on if you're doing environmental impact statements and things like that, where you get a map where a wetland is. You define it sometimes by the kinds of plants that are in it. So this actually has three kinds of wetland in one. The three main kinds are swamps, marshes, and bogs. They're all wet, like I'm going to demonstrate here. I'm going to get my boots totally soaked now. If it's mostly grasses, like these cattails and other grasses, you call it a marsh. If it's mostly trees, like these, or say you're down south and you're in the Okefenokee swamp, if it's mostly trees, you call it a swamp. If it's mostly mosses, you call it a bog. So because of the theme of the lab being non-flowering plants, we're going to focus on the mosses right here. So here's some right here. I'm going to pull a few of them up. These are non-flowering plants. They're not ferns. They're not horsetails. They're in their own group, division Bryophyta, which basically means mosses. So these are different from all the other plants because they don't have veins in their leaves either. The technical term for that is non-vascular. They don't have tubes for the sap to flow through or anything like that, like the ferns and the horsetails and the flowering plants do and things like that. So these are non-vascular plants, and they don't have flowers, and they don't have seeds. So this is similar to the first kinds of plants that lived on land way before the dinosaurs. So if this is the dominant plant in your wetland, you call it a bog. So this kind that's known for growing in bogs is called sphagnum. It's very porous and it holds a lot of water. So not only does it like a wet habitat, but it makes the habitat wet. So if you squeeze this, I'll bet you anything, a bunch of water will come out like that. So this just shows you they're like a living sponge. People through the ages have used it for all kinds of things. If you dry it, you can burn it. It's called peat. In the old days, settlers chinked the gaps in their log cabins with it. You can use it for insulation. Native folks used it for diaper packing or stockings for your shoes and things like that. But basically, it makes a certain kind of a habitat called a bog. The other thing is it changes the chemistry of the bog. When you squeeze that water out, if you measured the chemistry of it, it would be very acidic. And the acidic water in a bog doesn't have a lot of bacteria or fungi that can break things down and make them decay like they would out in the woods. And so dead things in a bog just kind of lie there. So if you look underneath, there's old dead plants here that used to be living mosses. These are the ancestors of these mosses, still there like mummies preserved underneath. And you can just go down and down and down back through the past. In some cases here in the Adirondacks, we've gone back 7,000 or more years, layer by layer by layer, all through the generations of the mosses to when the bog originally formed. Here we are with one more kind of plant that never makes flowers, never makes seeds. It's Lycophytes. There are some common names for these. Some people call them princess pines, ground cedars, club mosses, all kinds of things. None of those names are correct. If it were a moss, a club moss, it would not have veins in the leaves, but these do. So it's not really a moss. In fact, one that's called club moss, you can actually see an example of over here. Here's a whole other type right here. See, it looks kind of like a moss, but it's bigger. It's got a big old stem. These are real leaves with veins in them, so it's not a moss. They're not cedars, ground cedars, or pines like princess pines, because those make cones, and they're big. This is as big as these are going to get. This is an entirely different kind of plant. Lycophyta is the name, which means wolf foot or wild foot. It's like a fuzzy wolf paw, or just means a plant you find out in the woods instead of in a field or a garden or something like that. So like the mosses, like the ferns, like the horsetails, they don't reproduce with flowers or seeds or cones or anything. They use spores, these big ones. And so here's a piece of it here that would have been making spores. This would be a sporophyte plant. When the spores fall to the ground, each one of those dust-sized spores will have an embryo in it. If it lands on the right kind of soil, it could grow into a tiny, tiny little plant called a gametophyte. When it reaches maturity, it's still tiny. You hardly ever see them anywhere around here. They're hard to find. If you did, they'll release sperm or egg in here, and when the egg gets fertilized by the sperm, it grows into something that looks like this. So again, alternation of generations. You got sporophytes that look like this. These are the same species. When they make babies with the spores, the babies look like this other kind of plant, but it's still the same species. They're still lycophytes. They reproduce with sperm or eggs. When they grow up, they grow into this. So it alternates. Sporophytes, gametophytes, sporophytes, gametophytes. So these are cool in so many ways. One of them is they're connected underground. So when you find a bunch of these together, there's a good chance there's a runner. So it's not just one plant and here's another plant, here's another. This is one plant occupying this whole area. If we look around here, there's some more. You could say, as far as we know, we don't want to kill them all to find out, but this could all just be one plant, all connected. And same thing with this, just sending up runners and shoots. So this whole grove of them is one individual. In fact, we're finding out some trees are that way too. An entire forest can be one plant, basically, but that's definitely the case here. So then you can say, well, now that's interesting. If you cut this right here, you now have two plants. That's kind of weird. How long does this plant live? Nobody knows. Some people speculate this kind of thing, you can just go on and on for thousands of years and be thousands of years old for all we know. And speaking of big time scales like that, there's another cool thing about this. These have ancestors that are from the time way before the dinosaurs. And in those days, there were forests on land. There were insects flying around in them. There were amphibians and things hundreds of millions of years ago. And there were forests that looked a lot like this, but instead of having spruce and fir and beech trees, they were these. They had ancestors that were as tall as trees. So you could come back traveling through time right to this very spot. You would find the ancestor of these in a forest, tree-sized. Some of them have been preserved as coal. So when we burn coal, we call it fossil fuels. That's actually fossilized forests of the ancestors of these kinds of plants, along with tree-sized ferns as well. So it's like ancient firewood. But the most amazing thing, I think, is not only do these have ancestors that made the first forests, but there were also small plants in those forests, the size of these, which look exactly like these. So these could be some of the oldest, longest lasting plant species on the whole planet, from before the time of any of these flowers, any of those kinds of trees, even before dinosaurs. This is like looking back through time in a time capsule. So in a spare moment, if you're out in the woods and you see these, get down close and pretend those are tree size. It's a lot of fun.